So, dear participants, dear colleagues, dear friends, welcome to this meeting of the Leuven Seminar in Classical German Philosophy. Today, we will discuss a new book with the title Romantic Empiricism, Nature, Art and Ecology from Herder to Humboldt. This monograph investigates the understudied tradition of Romantic empiricism, highlights its significance for the development of ecology, and argues for its contemporary relevance in addressing environmental questions and concerns. By showing how the Romantic empiricists deepened their understanding of nature through artistic skills and tools, it also demonstrates the significance of art for knowledge and highlights the ways in which epistemology, aesthetics, and ethics are fundamentally interdependent. This book was recently published by Oxford University Press, and its author is Dalia Nassar, who is here with us. Welcome, Dalia. Dalia Nassar is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Sydney, and her research sits at the intersection of the history of German philosophy and environmental philosophy and ethics. Among her many publications, I will just refer to her first book, The Romantic Absolute, Being and Knowing in Early German Romantic Philosophy, 1795-1804, which was published 2014 with Chicago University Press. Dalia also has a strong interest in the contributions of women philosophers and in the ways in which philosophical canon formation has sidelined them. She has co-edited with Christine Gesdal 2 volumes on women philosophers, including an anthology of primary works, which is titled Women Philosophers in the 19th Century, the German Tradition. Now, this will be the structure of our meeting. First, Dalia will give a short presentation of her book, and then I will give the floor to Benjamin Berger, who will give his comments and raise some questions. And then Dalia will be given the occasion to shortly reply. And following this model, we will then also have comments and questions by Christina Pinstorff and Giulia Valpione. Normally, Giulia will come first after Benjamin. After the comments and replies, all participants will, of course, have the occasion to participate in the discussion and to ask questions. And so please, until that moment, until you are given the floor to ask a question, please remain muted. As usual, we also would like to request you to have your camera running, but this is not, of course, not an obligation. And as usual, we will also extend the meeting with an informal part, but this part won't be recorded. So if you would have missed the occasion to ask a question, there's still the occasion during the informal part. So Dalia, I am really happy that we can organize this with you, and you can immediately start now with a précis of your book, which ideally shouldn't be any longer than 8 minutes.
So Henny, can I add that I just put the discount flyer in the chat?
Yes, so there is a discount flyer for those, I think all of you who will like to buy the book will have a much better price, thanks to the flyer that you find in the chat. So please join me in welcoming Dalia, and Dalia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Henny, very much. And of course, thanks to Louise for organizing this, for suggesting this idea. It was a great pleasure meeting you a few weeks ago in Munich, so it's also very nice that I got to have that. And it was also very nice to meet the others from Leuven, Karen also, and Henny, and Pavel, and Stephen. So thanks all of you for coming, for allowing me to share some thoughts in this venue. And of course, many, many thanks to the 3 respondents, Ben, Giulia, and Christina. I'm so grateful that you took the time from your very busy schedules to read and think these ideas and share them with me. Ben, thank you for stepping in the last minute. I'm very appreciative that you were able to do that. So I thought I'd begin by just saying how this book emerged in a way, because a lot of it you can read in the introduction. About the introduction is a kind of preface, so I didn't want to give you the introduction, which you can just read. I thought I'd just tell you about the process behind how it began. And I have to say, I worked on the book for about 10 years. I started in 2012. So it was a very, very long process. And when I first began, I felt like I was for a long, long time just groping in the dark. I had a strong intuition, but I could not fully articulate what this intuition is about. And I think a really good analogy is I felt like it was this embryonic form that wasn't formed. It was this just sort of to think about it in organic terms. And so it was this chaos with a sort of like an impulse, but the impulse was quite vague. And at that time, I really could not have anticipated the things that I came to realize some 10 years later. Instead, what I sensed some 10 years ago was that although the 18th and 19th century German philosophy was a very well-trodden terrain, there were aspects of it, crucial aspects that haven't been adequately recognized, not to mention properly understood. And I also had the sense that these understudied elements might be relevant in our contemporary context of ecological crisis. And so it was with these intuitions that I started doing the research and then sort of started to write. But really what enabled me to arrive at a leading thread, and I have memories of sitting in trains and trying to outline the book and finding myself over and over being unable to find the leading thread, like what unifies all of this. What enabled me were conversations with people at workshops, at conferences, at colloquia, and so on. And so there's just so much collaboration behind this book that is not so clear. And I just want to mention that to me, this was these various voices, these various nudges from the outside enabled this book to take form. So genuinely, it went from this kind of chaotic, very inchoate form and began to become shaped through these various external influences to which I was responding. So again, there's a lot of kind of organic images here, but I really think this is how it happened. John Zamito, for instance, pushed me to read the French thinkers and said, you can't do Herder unless you read Diderot and Buffon. Eric Watkins and Clinton Tolley invited me and read the manuscript over 3 days and gave me incredible comments on my interpretation of the Kant-Herder relationship. Kristin Hjesdahl gave me all of these texts by Herder. She said, you have to read the Shakespeare essay. And without that Shakespeare essay, my interpretation of Herder would have been totally different. Danny Sellemeyer helped me to understand the significance of the concept of knowledge I was developing in Goethe. And there's so many other people that I can mention. And I just won't go, the list is very long, but I just want to acknowledge that although I'm at fault for all the problems of this book, you can't blame many of these people, I am still very grateful. And I really do think that something different emerged because, and really this book emerged because of their invaluable input. So what was the leading thread that began to emerge? Well, I had expected that I was going to find a distinctive philosophical tradition that had gone under the radar. And I thought that this tradition differed from various schools of philosophy, empiricism, rationalism, idealism, and romanticism. And it combines certain aspects of each of these traditions, but it was genuinely coherent and not just a kind of a random synthesis of them. So like empiricism, I thought that this tradition was developed a bottom-up methodology and emphasized observation and remaining with the phenomenon. Like rationalism, this tradition emphasized the need to arrive at a necessary rather than merely contingent insight. Like idealism, it didn't overlook the significant role of the knowing subject, and like romanticism, it was critical of abstractions and unnecessary systems. And I also had expected that at the heart of this tradition was Goethe, whose distinctive approach to the study of the natural world, which Schiller described as rational empiricism, joined the various impulses in an integrated and generative way. I also expected that Goethe's approach, with its emphasis on the concrete and its critique of abstract concepts, can be brought to contemporary environmental questions and concerns, many of which suffer from a tendency to abstraction. So these were the kinds of things I had expected when I started. What I had not expected was that this philosophical tradition can teach us a great deal about interdisciplinarity and collaboration across the arts and sciences. What I had also not expected was that this tradition played a crucial role in the emergence of ecology, or what we might describe as ecological consciousness. And finally, what I had not expected was that this tradition would shed important light on the ethics of knowledge and how some certain practices of knowing, whether in the arts or the sciences, can discourage or even outright hinder ethical responses. So let me take a few steps back and give you a sense of these various insights and how they emerged. From the beginning, I dubbed this tradition romantic empiricism, and I could have called it rational empiricism, but I'm glad that I called it romantic. I called it romantic because I wanted to signal that it was in the time of the romantics, the Jena romantics, but I came to realize after lots of nudges that the term romantic is the most apt because of the emphasis that these thinkers placed on the arts and aesthetic experiences. They all realized that art has a cognitive value and is not purely aesthetically or emotionally valuable. And they saw in art an epistemic significance in that it can transform the way we perceive and think about the world, and that this transformation can have a vast impact on our practices. And this led me to the far more substantial, some substantial insights about interdisciplinarity and the way in which these thinkers practiced interdisciplinarity in an exemplary way. As you would have read or will read, they were all practicing scientists in some way, whether they contributed to some form of, whether to anthropology or to geography or morphology, but they were also writing artistic works, and they were also literary critics and so on. And so they basically, through their own artistic works and their practices as artists, they genuinely sought to overcome cognitive problems or to overcome problematic cognitive tendencies. And for this reason, they came to the view that art has crucial cognitive significance. So I won't say much more because I reached my 8 minutes, but I will just say one thing, that romantic empiricism really challenges us to think more carefully about the very practice of knowing. And this was something that I didn't really understand at the beginning and came to recognize it at the end. That it challenges us first from as a historian of philosophy. It challenges our histories, our usual histories of 19th century philosophy, and our usual ways of dividing and distinguishing philosophical schools, empiricist, romantic, and rationalist. And it also challenges the very way we conceptualize philosophy, what philosophy is, and what philosophy can and should seek to achieve. And it also challenges our understanding of the relationship between philosophy, the arts, and the natural sciences, and our understanding of the relationship between perception, feeling, imagination, and understanding. In a word, it challenges the ways we conceive of knowledge, and I think also our very practices of knowing. But in challenging us, I think romantic empiricism also shows us a way forward, a way beyond the discursive aporias, of discursive thought, beyond hard and fast disciplinary distinctions, and beyond the all too common separation of perception, feeling, imagination, understanding. And for these reasons, I think It offers invaluable insights for addressing the ecological crisis, which is not only a biophysical crisis, but as Val Plumwood put it, is also a crisis of reason. Or as the Romantic empiricists would put it, a crisis of understanding, feeling, imagination, and perception, and their problematic sundering. So Romantic empiricism offers us important challenges for how we do philosophy, for what we think of as philosophy, and insights. These challenges upend our histories of philosophy and our histories of science, our disciplinary distinctions, and they demand us to think more clearly about our practices of knowledge and their real-world impact. By offering an important alternative to our contemporary practices, by showing us how we can transform perception, thinking, and feeling to work with and build on one another, Romantic empiricism has, I think, the potential to radically shift the very way we know, and it is my hope that we all undertake this radical shift. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Dalia. So congratulations again with this very good book. And I think we can now directly go to Benjamin Berger. So he will specifically concentrate on the part of the monograph that deals with Herder. Benjamin Berger is visiting assistant professor of philosophy at Trinity College in Hartford. He specializes in 19th century idealism and philosophy of nature, but has also significant interests in ancient Greek philosophy, continental rationalism, and more recent European philosophy. Thematically, he is especially interested in topics in metaphysics, environmental philosophy, the philosophy of art, also the philosophy of technology, and philosophy of religion. So very broad thematically. He is the author of Schelling, Hegel, and the Logic of Emergence from Nature to Spirit, which is under contract with Routledge. And he is the co-author with Daniel Whistler of the Schelling-Eschenmayer controversy, 1801, Nature and Identity, which was published by Edinburgh University Press in 2020. And he's also the co-editor, again with Daniel Whistler, of The Schelling Reader, which was published with Bloomsbury in 2021. So Benjamin, please go ahead. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Henny, and thank you to Luis and Karin and all the other organizers. The first thing I want to say is that this book is truly a pleasure to read, and I just want to encourage everyone who hasn't read it to do that. It's extremely insightful and full of important arguments for anyone interested in the philosophies of nature and science of the period. One of the recurring themes in Nassar's book is that within the Romantic empiricist tradition, we find a distinctive account of what it means to give an account of natural phenomena. According to Nassar, Kant's third critique sets the stage for this new approach, but Kant fails to unambiguously affirm the idea that the approach is both legitimate and necessary for achieving genuine knowledge. By contrast, Herder, Goethe, and Humboldt do affirm the legitimacy and necessity of this new approach. So my comments are going to focus on the reading of Herder in chapters 2 and 3, because Herder is the first in this series of thinkers to really embrace this new way of explaining by, quote, transforming the very project of understanding. At the end of the first chapter of the book, Nassar asks the following: can elucidation and description expand and deepen our understanding of nature without offering explanations? For Herder and his successors, the answer to this question is yes. One of the ways Nassar illustrates this is through a reading of his treatise on the origin of language. She also develops very persuasive readings of a number of other texts. I'm just focusing on the treatise. In that text, Herder advances an account of the origin of language that's meant to differ from previous accounts. More specifically, he aims to move beyond accounts that either identify the divine logos as the origin of human language or imagine a natural process through which the human animal's grunts and groans become transformed into language proper. For Herder, both of these accounts of human language are abstract, and they fail to get to the heart of the question about the origin of human language. As Nassar makes clear, For Herder, the question about the origin of human language isn't really asking about when human language came to be or what brought human language into existence. Instead, it's asking about what human language is essentially and about how it is both similar to and different from the languages of animals. According to Nassar, in reconsidering the essential meaning of the question about the origin of language, Herder develops a novel practice of knowing, in which the philosopher, quote, goes back to the phenomenon itself. Going back to the phenomena means attending to actually existing animals and humans, observing their activities, and then describing those activities. Nassar refers to this description of phenomena as a way to, quote, provide an account or an explanation of things. According to Nassar, quote, this means that for Herder, there is no difference between what descriptions and explanation offer. In fact, she goes on, quote, it is only through description that explanation is possible, end quote. Description is the only legitimate form of explanation because it doesn't seek to get beneath or behind the phenomenon in order to explain it, a procedure that would result in our no longer attending to the phenomenon as it is. This is the problem, according to Nassar, with both rationalism and ordinary empiricism. They seek to give an account of why something is the way it is by either deriving it from a rational principle or inferring its efficient cause. And those principles and causes will always be other than that which they're meant to explain. By describing humans, animals, and their worlds, we arrive at a true form of knowledge, in this case, knowledge of language. Such descriptions make language intelligible. Language makes sense in light of such descriptions. Importantly, Herder doesn't give up on the more traditional project of achieving knowledge of something necessary, but rather than attempting to derive the necessary features of nature through an abstract rationalist procedure, he seeks to grasp the necessary from particular instances, discovering the elements of a phenomenon that are essential to it being the phenomenon it is. One upshot of this interpretation is that it helps Nassar defend Herder against the Kantian criticism that in the ideas, Herder misguidedly attempts to derive the power of reason from the erect posture of the human animal. According to Nassar, Kant's critical review misses the mark because Herder's philosophical procedure isn't aiming at the derivation of human reason. That's not what knowledge of natural phenomena is for Herder. Nevertheless, Herder is seeking to demonstrate that the structure of the human organism and its capacity for reason and language are necessary elements of one and the same form of life. All of this is closely related to Nassar's argument that Herder is focused primarily on the observation of natural form over and above an inquiry into the underlying forces of nature. Quote, while Herder did not completely disavow the notion of force, and while it certainly plays an important role in his metaphysics, his emphasis on what appears, on the phenomenon and the form, challenges any reading of Herder that places force at the heart of his methodology and philosophy of science, end quote. The reason Nassar takes Herder to privilege form is relatively straightforward, and it follows from everything we've just gone over. An investigation of form will involve attending to the particular and observable features of a phenomenon. An investigation of force will involve attending to some unobservable and more general principle or cause of the phenomenon. By observing particular natural phenomena and not worrying himself with the forces underlying those phenomena, by, quote, focusing on how something appears rather than why it appears, quote, end quote, Herder is able to develop knowledge about what things are like. Nassar thus makes a very compelling case for the idea that a certain form of empiricism can put us into contact with what there is essentially. I find that persuasive, but here are some questions. First of all, I'd be interested to know how similar Nassar thinks all this is to Husserlian phenomenology. I don't see anything like the suspension of judgment here, but the connection to phenomenology seems significant, and I think she has something like that on her mind. In the conclusion to the book, for instance, she remarks that, quote, the romantic empiricists offer a new approach to knowledge, a way of knowing and being in the world, a way that remains anchored in the phenomena and in lived experience. So I'm curious to know what Nassar makes of that relationship between those two traditions. Second question, Nassar argues that unlike ordinary empiricism, the romantic empiricists can get us to see a kind of necessity that's typically associated with rationalism. And here the similarity to phenomenology is apparent as well. I think it's worth noting, though, that the kind of necessity here is different from the kind of necessity that's typically sought after by rationalist or idealist philosophers. on Nassar's reading of Herder, the necessity that the philosopher uncovers seems to be something like this. Certain features of a phenomenon are necessary to that phenomenon being the phenomenon it is. But this isn't the only kind of necessity that a rationalist is after. What about that deeper sense of necessity? The reason why such forms must exist in the first place. Is that kind of necessity simply abandoned by romantic empiricism? In chapter 5, Nassar suggests, following Schiller, that rational derivation fails to get us to any kind of necessity concerning the actual world, that the, quote, logically necessary has nothing to do with the empirically real. So why should we think that's the case? Why wouldn't knowing what's logically necessary tell us something important about the real or the actual? Third question, I wonder if Nassar overemphasizes, at least with respect to Herder, the romantic empiricist rejection of classical investigations into why things are the way they are. Is Herder really so uninterested in that type of explanation? In acknowledging that unlike his empiricist successors, he develops a metaphysics of force, Nassar also seems to acknowledge that there's this other side of Herder's philosophy of nature. It's the side of him that seeks to explain the diversity of the natural world in terms of something more fundamental than that which can be observed, namely in terms of a single vital force. Okay, I'm trying to go quickly here to keep it to 8 minutes. My fourth and final question has less to do with what the romantic empiricists thought and more to do with what we should make of what they thought. If it's right to say that the romantic empiricists turn away from considering why things appear in order to focus on how they appear, doesn't the tradition miss out on something central to philosophical reasoning? Is our knowledge of nature really complete once we've described all phenomena and all essential forms? And as indispensable as that kind of knowledge is, it seems to be necessary. Don't we also want to know more than that? And aren't we justified in that desire? Perhaps Herder was misguided to turn to the concept of force as ultimately explanatory, but isn't his speculative impulse an important one, one without which philosophy is worse off? Thanks.
Thanks very much, Ben. Those are great questions. In a way, your questions revolve around a crucial question, the one question, which is about explanation. Isn't explanation more important than these thinkers are willing to give it? Is it more important in Herder that I'm willing to give it, and so on? So I think it's perhaps a good idea to focus on that. But perhaps I'll just say one thing in relation to phenomenology. I do think that these thinkers might be described as proto-phenomenologists. Goethe has been described as proto-phenomenologist. The others haven't been, but that's just because probably people haven't done that, studied them that much as Goethe. And the lived experience aspect is definitely something that Humboldt emphasizes, as Christina knows. And I think that he's definitely moving in that direction, which would be an interesting kind of investigation. As to the question of necessity and the why versus the how question. So I think in a really important way, I think that they are asking us to think about philosophy differently, to think about the task of knowledge differently. And the question is, well, what is the gain here? Why do we want to focus on the how question? And I think that if you look at the natural world, nature, and in a way, everything appears before us. And everything appears and has a form. And we could ask ourselves endlessly, why does it have this particular form? And we can have lots and lots and lots of really interesting answers, but it's not going to give us an insight into the coherence and integrity of the form, of how all of these things together are manifesting the form. And so in a way, I think a lot of our experience and our understanding and our science of biology or ecology presupposes these forms, but doesn't really acknowledge them as these kind of underpinning basis for which we go about understanding nature. But they are there. And until we start asking the question of how do they appear? How do they manifest themselves in this context and how do they manifest themselves in that context, we're not going to actually be looking at them. And so I think the how question helps us to see what is important here and what is being presupposed when we ask the why question. So it shifts our attention. And once we start to look at the phenomenon and how it appears over time differently and try to see how it is related, how it appears differently in different spaces and in different times and so on, we start to grasp the phenomenon in a far more integrated way. We see that it's not just a random thing that happens to look like this here, happens to look like that there, but we start to grasp or discern a unity that we would miss otherwise, but also to discern continuity between different phenomena, relationships between it and the world that it inhabits, and so on. And those things are all missed if we're only concerned with the why, because the why can give us all sorts of really interesting answers, but they're not going to point us to this how of appearance. And the why, I think, as I said, presupposes the forms, but does not really ask how are these forms possible. I think that another reason why this how question is so important is because it keeps us going back to the phenomenon. And I think philosophy does suffer from abstracting too much from the phenomenon. We often forget what it is that we're talking about. We, as Herder says, we turn a phenomena into ideas, and then we forget that they're real and that they're out there. And by focusing on the how of appearance, the question forces us to remain in dialogue with the phenomenon and therefore opens us up to being challenged by it, right? We don't simply move on. We've conceptualized it, boom, it's over, and we go on to the next thing. But by allowing ourselves to constantly say, how does it appear here? How does it appear there? We are always in contact with the phenomenon, and we always allow it to be guiding us rather than simply guided by our question of why are you here? So it really does shift our focus, and it opens up the possibility of being challenged by the phenomenon in an ongoing way. I think I'll just say one final thing about the how and why question. I think, is there a problem? Are we overlooking, why is it, like, one fundamental philosophical question is, why is there something instead of nothing? And are they just like not asking that question? That's a really good question. Is it not being posed at all? Have they just given up on it? Is this a kind of post-Kantian form of humility? Perhaps it is. And perhaps what they're saying is that there are far more productive things to be doing rather than keep asking the question of why something instead of nothing. On the other hand, I think that they point us to see things that have been completely overlooked, like relations and like different forms of predication. When we focus a lot on the why, what something is, like this is a table, and we just put it under the form universal concept of table. Good, we've figured it out and we move on. But if we allow ourselves to just focus on how this appears in various contexts, we don't think about predication as a simple X is Y, but rather X is what it is in relation to all of these other things. And so it opens up a different form of thinking about identity and what makes something what it is. It emphasizes relationality in a way that the usual ways of predicating and understanding identity. And so I think these are all really important things that we just overlook usually when we focus a lot on the why question and we think about why and what, and to the exclusion of the how and the phenomenon as something that appears. So these are just some thoughts. I think that the challenge is still outstanding, in the sense of, do they give it up? Have we lost something? But it is a real request to shift our focus. And there are really positive things, I think, about shifting that focus.
Okay, thanks a lot, Dalia, for this reply. We go directly to Giulia Valpioni, who is a postdoc at the University of Padua and also at the University of Trento. And Julia is the editor of a collected volume with the title L'homme et la nature, connaissances politiques et esthétiques dans le romantisme allemand, which was published in 2020 with Lied Verlag. She is also, together with Laure Cahen-Morel, the co-editor of a relatively new, but as I understood already, quite successful journal, which is called Sim Philosophy, International Journal of Philosophical Romanticism. So a journal that really fills a gap, so to say, in academics. So for interests in romantic philosophy. She also wrote a chapter in a collection that was actually co-edited by Dalia, namely the Oxford Handbook of Women in 19th Century Philosophy in the German tradition. And the title of her chapter there was Romanticism and Idealism. Since we shouldn't lose a lot of time, I go directly, not going to say what else she published, and I give her the floor for her comments. Thanks for wanting to do this, Julia.
Thank you very much for your invitation. Do you hear me good? Okay.
Well, I think that, Henny, I think that we need to make sure that Dalia can hear Julia properly, yeah?
Okay.
Yes.
Perfect. So first of all, congratulations, Dalia, for this wonderful book, which is wonderfully written. As Benjamin already said, it's really a nice reading, and it's easy to read without losing the deep analysis of these authors. So really congratulations. And I think it will have a big influence on future research, honestly. What I really appreciate was the capacity, not common, to connect a discussion of the actual debate and a rigorous historical philosophical research. So I'm really happy you published this book, and I'm really happy I've read it, and I'm really happy to discuss about it. At the beginning, I thought about 3 points, 3 arguments I would like to discuss with you, but since, as always, I've wrote too much, I thought of too many things to say, so maybe I will limit myself to 2 of them, which I think are more interesting. And in case we have time later, I will go to the last one. So the 2 most important things concern environmental reflections implied in your volume. And the second one, it's the influence of romantic empiricism on later philosophy, because you say you think that unfortunately this romantic empiricism wasn't able to influence later philosophy, but I don't agree with that, and I would like to know what you think of it. And the third point that maybe we'll discuss about it later are more precise questions on historical philosophical points, so how these authors, so Herder, Goethe, and Humboldt, related to others. So I will begin with romantic empiricism as a tradition, we can say. So in your book, you say that romantic empiricism and its philosophy of science, its philosophy of nature, didn't have a big success in the history of thought. But I'm not sure about it. What I think instead is it had a huge influence, but not in the natural sciences, but rather on the first point, on historical thought. So to follow Kant's reflections in the third critique, not on nature, but on history. So it seems to me that some questions you identify in Herder, Goethe, and Humboldt are in fact discussed also within the historical discipline. So how can we read historical phenomena? How are related concepts and phenomena, for example? And second, it might be interesting to identify direct influences of romantic empiricism on a new discipline that began to be discussed some years later, that is the science of society, what later has been called sociology. It is striking, in fact, how similar are some ideas such as Hauptform or type, so that of which you speak in your volume in Herder and Goethe in particular, to Max Weber's sociology, for example, that characterize him and differentiate him from French sociology, because he focused on the idea of idealtypus as the main point, the most important thing to discover for a sociologist. So I would like to know what you think about it. Maybe it had an influence, but not on the philosophy of nature. The second point on environmental reflection. So I would like to focus on chapter 5, in particular on paragraph 5.4, called Goethe's Environmental Ethics and the Source of Responsibility. I would like to quote some passages that I hope will help summarize your argumentations. At page 166, I quote for both Goethe and Alexander von Humboldt, ethical considerations cannot be divorced from epistemological or ontological questions. At page 171, in knowing badly, the knower is not only failing herself, she's also failing the community in which she makes a claim to knowledge. For as soon as she presents herself as knower to others, she implicitly takes on the responsibility to know well. And the last quotation, page 174, responsibility is understood not only as a moral ideal that concerns actions and behaviors, but also an epistemic virtue, that is, the responsibility to know well. That is, end of the quote, following your argumentations, responsibility to treat the known as a collaborator in the process towards knowledge. It is astonishing for me how much this reminds me of Foucault, Michel Foucault, in particular of his later lessons on Greek philosophy. Foucault identifies two different traditions in the history of philosophy. The first one focused on the ancient motto, know yourself, nocti se auton, and the other one following the motto, care of the self, epimeleia e autou. These two in Greek philosophy, following Foucault, went almost always together and got progressively separated. On one side, we have modern philosophy, following which the knowledge of truth does not involve a transformation of the subject, of what you call the knower. The subject, as it is, can grasp the truth, and the limits of knowledge are based on the epistemic structure of the subject. On the other, we have another tradition that he calls spirituality, that says that the subject, as it is not capable to grasp the truth. So to have access to the truth, the subject must transform herself. Foucault says this second tradition were excluded from what we call philosophy or science, even if it deals with the truth and with the instruments we must have to grasp the truth. So Foucault seems to exclude that in modernity, some philosophers follow this second tradition. So changing, the subject must change to grasp the truth. But one of his teachers that inspired him his whole life was Pierre Hadot, that on the contrary sustained that also in modernity there were philosophers that saw the approach to truth not only as an epistemological but also an ethical question. And one of them indeed is Goethe. I'm referring to his book, N'oublie pas de vivre, Don't Forget to Live. So if I'm not wrong, you say that knowledge involves ethics, but you may correct me, of course, if I've understood wrongly. So knowledge involves ethics because we have the responsibility to know well, to search the truth, to say it in a trivial way, before the scientific community or before the public. So we have to see the known as a collaborator in order to know it. But if we integrate Foucault and those researchers, we can say that Foucaultian knowledge is ethical because knowledge involves an ethics in the sense of a praxis, a transformation of the subject, using Foucault's words, that changes her eyes and allows her to see the truth, to know well. And for our greatest truth is that all beings are connected. So ethics might be seen not only as responsibility towards the scientific community, but the very condition to grasp the truth. So I would love to know what you think of it. I'm sorry, I don't know how much time I have. Do I still have some minutes or?
Yes, let's say you have 2 minutes more.
Okay, thank you. So I go back to historical philosophical questions. I'll try to pick only two. So concerning always ancient philosophy, let's say, romantic empiricism and ancient philosophy. At page 159, but also in other pages, it seems to me that you try to downsize the importance of Platonic philosophy on the philosophers you are analyzing. And I agree with that because for sure, Platonic traditions had an influence on the philosophy of this period, but sometimes its interpretation overshadows the importance, for example, of Aristotle's philosophy that is very often forgotten. So what do you think? Do you have any thoughts about the possibility to highlight the influence of Aristotle instead of Plato? Do you think that downsizing Plato might imply a prominent role of Aristotle or romantic empiricism? Because I think it had a huge role in what we usually call romanticism. But we always said Platonic tradition was central, Plato was central, but we forget how important it was, particularly for their ethics, for their political philosophy. And so the last point, so you, in your introduction, you define, and you also repeated it today, that what you mean with romantic. So the importance of the aesthetic experience. But I think there are, of course, a lot of many other reasons why we should call this part of German philosophy as romantic. I'm thinking to what you write about the fact that the philosophical scientific text, their Darstellung, must somehow represent the dynamic aspects of nature. And we can find it also in romantic theory of the fragments as the most appropriate Darstellung of philosophy. But there are also many other reasons why we should be careful, because there are huge differences also between romantic empiricism and romanticism. I think the main one, and I would like to know what you think of it, is that the philosophers you wrote about follow Newton's motto, hypothesis non fingo. So they refuse to go beyond experience. The romantic interpretation of the meaning of transcendental, what is transcendental philosophy, allows them to sustain that if we cannot say what's beyond the limits of our senses or intellectual faculties, we can still say something on it. This has consequences on their metaphysics, and you wrote about it. But I think this has consequences also in their philosophy of nature. They concentrate on the role of the natural forces, whose role in Herder's philosophy you try to downsize in your text, as you also repeated after Benjamin questions. And they apply this theory, the Herder's theory of forces, to say something on Leben, on life, which is nothing less and nothing more than Spinoza's natura naturans, or dynamis, potentia in Latin, that comes before energia, that is form, in fact. So I would love to know what you think about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. And we go directly to the reply by Dalia.
Thank you, Julia. Lots to think about there. I don't know the sociology that you mentioned at the beginning, so I'd be really interested in learning more about that. Kristen Yesdal and I have had lots of conversations about the sort of humanistic legacy of romantic empiricism in history and linguistics, and that's her sort of focus, and my focus is, we always think of us as sort of like the focus, she focuses on the history and linguistics and I focus on the nature. But, and so for me, working out this tradition of romantic empiricism and pointing to these authors did not mean that I exclude other authors, but rather that I open up ways of thinking about these people as connected and as having a methodology and certain conceptual apparatus that they all share. And of course, Friedrich Schlegel could be considered a romantic empiricist who focuses more on history and languages. He does do a little bit on nature, but not that much. And the other Humboldt brother would be similarly connected in that. So there's definitely another romantic empiricist tradition that is much more focused on the humanistic, without entirely excluding natural. I think that's exactly right. As for Goethe's environmental ethics, I completely agree with you. I'm very interested to learn about Foucault. I don't know the late Foucault, but I completely agree with you that ethics here does not only imply responsibility of the scientific community, but actually it is, knowledge itself is already an ethics, is a praxis. And in stepping into the role of knower, we are already becoming ethically involved. It is already an ethical act. Completely agree. I think that's there in Goethe as well. So it's not just a sort of a later responsibility that comes because other human beings enter into the picture, but it is precisely because for Goethe, we are always ill-equipped to begin with as knowers. We always have these cognitive biases that we need to overcome, and therefore we have this task before us. Completely agree. The question of whether the relationship between romantic empiricism and ancient philosophy is also a very good question. And the only time that I really talk about Aristotle is in relation to Kant. And so that's the only place where Aristotle surfaces, and it's sort of like how Kant is reworking Aristotle's different causes. And you know, again, you're opening up a really interesting thing, you know, path here. There's definitely, you know, I have to think a lot about whether there's a kind of implicit Aristotelian ethics here, maybe. I think that there might be. I definitely think that Goethe has Aristotelian qualities in his sort of his rational empiricism is in fact what Aristotle is doing. Someone wrote on this, Jacob Ziguris has a really nice article on how Goethe, although Goethe never read Aristotle, is very much following Aristotle. So it's definitely something that I'd have to think more about. But it seems to me that Aristotle would be the kind of crucial figure for these thinkers, even if they were not super familiar with him. The question about what, you know, their refusal to go beyond experience, and that's a very, very good question. Because the necessity is not something that you can just grasp with your physical eyes, right? You need your mind's eye. And that's why Goethe draws this distinction between seeing and seeing. And so there is a move beyond the physical in a, you know, what we can do with sensibility, but it's a move that requires us to always be in touch with what appears before us. So yes, we have to sort of try to grasp necessity, but this necessity draws on the observed and is always being tested against the observed. So there's this constant back and forth. So to me, it's a kind of, as I see their methodology, is very hermeneutic in that it is always a dialogue between what I can see with my sensible eyes and what I can see with my mind's eye. And the two have to always work together in order to be able to succeed, to get to somewhere. So it goes beyond experience if we think about experience as that which is sensibly given through the eyes, but it doesn't go beyond experience if we have a more kind of capacious notion of experience as that sort of that which is not just given to the sensible, but that which is discerned as crucial to the sensible, as necessary. So the sort of how Goethe starts to recognize that there is this relationship between the different parts of a plant. Well, you can't see that relationship unless you invoke your imagination and start to visualize it in your mind's eye. But that's part of what's in front of us. It's just not seen in the same way. Or how he talks about the character of a person. So the character is really there. It's in the person, but you have to, in order to discern it, to kind of get at the crucial aspect, you have to see everything in relationship to everything else and use the imagination to draw it all together and so on. So sensibility on its own wouldn't be able to get you to get to what really makes a plant or the crucial character of someone and so on. So that's a really interesting question. I think they do go beyond experience, assuming what we mean by experience is a sort of just what we are given with the physical eyes. Yeah, lots of things to think about there. I think I don't want to take up too much more time, but thank you so much, Julia. Really.
Thank you.
Thank you both. We go directly to Christina Pinsdorf. Christina ist wissenschaftliche Mitarbeiterin at the Institute für Wissenschaft und Ethik of the University of Bonn. And in 2016, she published a monograph with the title Lebensformen und Anerkennungsverhältnisse zur Ethik der belebten Natur, which was published with De Gruyter. Among her many papers, I just mentioned perhaps one which seems most relevant to our topic today, namely Humboldt's and Schelling's romantic empiricism in the Anthropocene, inspiration for the environmental humanities. And this is a text that was published in a volume with the title Life, Organisms and Cognition, Understanding Nature Between Classical German Philosophy and Current Debates. Please, Christina, the floor is yours for some comments.
Thank you very much. Dear Dalia, please let me first say a few words of appreciation of your person and your research work in general, because since I first met you in 2016, actually on a workshop in Bonn, I was just deeply impressed and inspired by you as a person, as a thinker, as a female thinker, and by now also as a mother and a great researcher at the same time. So in that same year I first met you, I read your insightful paper, Romantic Empiricism After the End of Nature. And within that paper, you mention the name Alexander von Humboldt for only 3 times. Yet one of the mentions made me feel challenged in a way that I started to turn my attention to Alexander von Humboldt, his relation to Schelling, and their potential to teach us something about today's inappropriate relation to nature. The sentence, which is probably responsible for me being invited today to say something about your recent book, is the following, so I quote your paper. In contrast to Schelling's systematic construction of nature, Herder, Goethe, and eventually Alexander von Humboldt were concerned with developing a new empiricism, what Schiller described as rational empiricism and what I call romantic empiricism, end of quote. Against the backdrop of this sentence, in which, as far as I know, you used the term romantic empiricism for the first time, I have written the paper Romantischer Empirismus im Anthropozän, Humboldt und Schellings Ideen für die Environmental Humanities, published 2020 in the International Review for Humboldt Studies. And as this sentence is still in line with the conviction you espouse in your new book, which I love, by the way, I will build my response on the thesis seemingly contradictory to your view as a substantial Schelling expert, that actually early Schelling is in fact a paradigmatic representative of what you wonderfully call romantic empiricism. In your new book, you oppose Schelling to the thinkers you classify as romantic empiricists, right? So how come I'm saying the opposite? In January 1805, Schelling writes his first letter to Humboldt, in which he complains about the prevailing methodology of empirical research. Quote, "Up to now, empirical researchers in Germany have lacked a man who would have understood the view as a whole and on a large scale." With Humboldt, however, he connects the hope of finding the sought-after scientific partner for his project. Humboldt responds enthusiastically to this request, quote, What should indeed attract my attention more than a revolution in those sciences to which my entire life is devoted?" Finally, he himself associates great hopes with Schelling because, quote, "I have always suspected that there must be something better and higher to which everything can be traced back, and this higher we now owe to your discoveries," end of quote. In that same letter, Humboldt clarifies that, quote, "Natural philosophy can never be detrimental to the progress of empirical sciences. On the contrary, it leads what has been discovered back to principles, and at the same time, it establishes new discoveries." Discoveries. Very similar to the way Dalia depicts how Humboldt shares the sense with Schiller, that I quote page 214, "There is something higher to look for and to find," end of quote. Humboldt and the early Schelling are sensing the same project. Humboldt, as well as early Schelling, reject a purely speculative method, which is to be found among many Schellingians, as well as with Hegel and then with late Schelling himself. Early Schelling holds instead, quote, "If it is the task of transcendental philosophy to subordinate the real to the ideal, it is, on the other hand, the task of natural philosophy to explain the ideal out of the real. Both sciences are therefore one science, differing only in the opposite direction of their tasks. Since both directions are not only equally possible, but equally necessary, both have the same necessity in the system of knowledge," end of quote. I would now like to summarize very briefly a selection of characteristics of a romantic empiricism pursuant to Humboldt and the early Schelling, which I have elaborated at length in the 2020 paper. So first, it's the critique of dualism and mechanism. Schelling evaluates the nature-spirit dualism as an evil of philosophy, which has to be passed through necessarily on the way to a higher goal. Quote, "As soon as man puts himself in contradiction with the outer world, the first step to philosophy has happened. With that separation first begins reflection. From now on, man separates what nature had united forever, separates the object from perception, the concept from the image, finally by becoming his own object, himself from himself. But this separation is only a means, not an end." End of quote. The real purpose of natural philosophy is to reach, starting from that first distance, necessary for gaining knowledge through separation, a reflected connectedness, a higher unity, a reunion through freedom. The mechanistic paradigm's juxtaposition of subject and object, nature and culture, or nature and freedom, is decisively rejected by both Schelling and Humboldt. For Humboldt, it holds true, quote, "One may now oppose nature to the realm of the spiritual, as if the spiritual were not also contained in the whole of nature, or one may oppose nature to art, such as radical separation of the physical from the intellectual," end of quote. This is for him not to be approved. Second, wholeness and unity of the multiplicity of nature. For Humboldt, it is the noblest goal of every natural research to trace the unity of the whole of nature. Quote, "Nature is for the thinking observation, unity and multiplicity. In this way, our endeavor reaches beyond the narrow limits of the world of the senses, and we can succeed in grasping nature, in mastering the raw material of empirical observation through ideas," end of quote. In a very similar way, for Schelling, the highest meaning of natural philosophy lies in its contribution to an integrated view on nature and the conscious restoration of the unity of nature and spirit. Humboldt strives for a, quote, book about nature in which both spheres of the unified cosmos, the outer perceptible through the senses, as well as the inner reflected spiritual world, equally gain in luminous clarity. End of quote. Man is only able to write this reflective, abstract book about nature because she has an original, intuitive, immediate access to it. Humboldt can tell a physical history of the world, quote, because there's a vivid and true reflection of the physical world in the innermost receptive sense. Everything is an ancient, mysterious intercourse with the temper of man, end of quote. Thus, at first glance, it is man who writes, measures, and maps, but it is nature itself that makes these processes possible in the first place, that guarantees a correspondence of scientific results with the external world, and ultimately co-produces them. In this sense, Schelling regards nature as, quote, a poem that lies locked in secret wonderful writing, end of quote. However, in the course of conscious reunion of nature and spirit, man is able to decipher it through the joint efforts of natural science and philosophy of nature, and so far as she traces the history of human spirit and nature. For only, quote, as long as myself I am identical with nature, I understand what a living nature is, as well as I understand my own life. I understand how this general life of nature reveals itself in the most manifold forms, in gradual developments and gradual approaches to freedom. But as soon as I separate myself and with me everything ideal from nature, nothing remains to me but a dead object, and I cease to understand how life outside of me is possible, end of quote. Against the background of this insight, one may understand Humboldt's attitude, quote, mindful of man's sublime destiny to grasp the spirit of nature, which lies veiled under the cover of appearances, end of quote, and Schelling's wonderful formula, let nature be the visible spirit, spirit be the invisible nature. 3, becoming or werden. For Schelling, the original union of spirit and nature lies in the essence of an individual nature, a self-organizing matter. Likewise, the necessity with which man is compelled to think of non-human living beings as purposeful also exists because of the inner laws of her individual nature. At the same time, however, in the case of living beings, quote, concept and object, form and matter are not originally and necessarily united in our imagination, but in the object itself, end of quote. Yet this in turn represents a conclusion that can only be drawn by the human mind. In the course of this great synthesis of nature and spirit, philosophy becomes genetic and no longer considers the system of ideas, quote, in its being, but in its becoming, end of quote. Unlike German idealism, Schelling in his early philosophy of nature does not locate the unity of nature and spirit unilaterally a priori in spirit, but rather traces the absolute identity of nature and spirit as a genesis in the history of natural culture, in which he even grants nature a certain primacy. With Humboldt, one may call it a, quote, natural history of the spirit, when Schelling ponders about the extent to which not only the earth, but the whole universe participated in the emergence of human consciousness. Fourth, the secret bond. With the metaphor of the secret bond, Schelling tries to represent the essential identity of nature and spirit. In Cosmos, Humboldt adopts the metaphor of the bond, quote, thus dark feelings and the interlinkage of sensual perceptions, as later the activity of combinatory reason, leads to the realization that a common nomological and therefore eternal bond embraces all of living nature. He furthermore describes, quote, the intimacy of the bond which links the two spheres, the physical and the spheres of intelligence and emotion, end of quote. For Schelling, that secret bond that links our spirit with nature is characterized by the fact that it places both in a historical developmental context and thus guarantees an, quote, indissolubly interlinked whole in reality, end of quote. In addition, Humboldt emphasizes the idea of a reciprocal interdependence of nature and spirit, according to which natural history always includes cultural history and vice versa. He addresses this view with explicit reference to Schelling, quote, thus plants intervene in the moral and political history of man. For if the history of natural objects can only be thought of as description of nature, then on the other hand, according to the statement of a profound thinker, Schelling's system of transcendental idealism, even changes in nature assume a genuinely historical character if they have an influence on human events, end of quote. With the metaphor of the secret bond, Schelling and Humboldt refer to something that eludes the capacity to be transported by language or even captured by measuring instruments. Here, both scientists come up against a boundary which also makes both of them turn to an aesthetic artistic approach to nature. I come to my last point, painting of nature or aesthetic epistemology. Humboldt and Schelling both ascribe to art as an aesthetic approach to nature particularly special importance. For as Schelling says in his 1802 lecture, it is an artistic activity of man that the active bond between man and nature becomes expressible for the first time. Art makes visible what can hardly be comprehended by thinking, thus revealing nature as unconscious poetry and art as self-conscious natural activity. Humboldt almost expects of Schelling, quote, a nature painting of a completely different and as it were higher kind in terms of natural philosophy. For the possibility for this, quote, has been founded by the bold enterprise of one of the most profound men of our century. Not entirely unfamiliar with the spirit of Schelling's system, I am far from the opinion that empiricists and natural philosophers should always repel each other as contending poles, end of quote. Conclusion. All in all, the upshot of my paper from 2020, which seems to be in basic disagreement with Dalia's new book that puts Schelling aside, is Humboldt and the early Schelling can be described as representatives of a romantic empiricism that stands for a close collaboration of the natural sciences with the humanities. Both advocate for an approach to nature that is at once empirical and speculative. And in particular, their approach can be made fruitful for no less than the elaboration of a scientifically sound, empirically phenomena saturated, nature ethically justifiable, and aesthetically rich human-nature relationship. Dalia, now I'm more than curious about your feedback. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Christina. That was very, very good. Very big challenges. So Christina's article makes me aware of and how much Humboldt did actually read Schelling and how much he really liked Schelling. And it, she gives all these really wonderful quotes in which Humboldt praises Naturphilosophie and says, as she read, the Naturphilosophie should not be regarded as the enemy. It provides us with the principles that are necessary for empirical research. And so it becomes a question of what is exactly the relationship between Naturphilosophie and romantic empiricism. It's a huge question. And I think that there is no reason to oppose them. And I think Humboldt's point is that they do support and enable one another. So Humboldt learns a lot from Schelling and Schelling learns a lot from Humboldt in the same way that Goethe learned a lot from Schelling and Schelling learned a lot from Goethe. I think that if there's the difference between them has to do with their methodology. So it's not so much that they disagreed on what nature is or on the relationship between knowledge and between, say, experience and empirical experience and a priori knowledge, because Schelling, of course, says in the introduction to his Entwurf eines Systems der Naturphilosophie, all judgments of experience become a priori judgments. So there's a strong anti-a priorism in the early Schelling, like you say, Christina. But the crucial point, so there's a lot of things, like you say, where they agree. I think on the doctrine level, they agree. But I think on the methodological level, that's where the difference emerges. So I'm interested in drawing out a methodology and a practice that differs from the usual philosophical way of going about knowing. So Schelling is interested from the get-go in, yes, he's interested in nature and in grasping the structure of nature as a whole, but he doesn't begin by observing specific phenomena. He begins with the two fundamental necessary principles that we must assume in order to make sense of nature. And those are infinite productivity in the 1799 text at least, and infinite, the opposite of infinite limitation. So he sort of begins with principles, and on the basis of these principles, he goes about and tries to understand natural phenomena. And he sees, and this is what he says is the construction of nature. And he sees that these two principles, or his aim is to see, and he calls these two principles the absolute hypothesis. And he wants to see how these two principles reiterate themselves across various natural phenomena, in the phenomenon of magnetism, in the phenomenon of electricity, and so on, until you get to the organism. And in the organism, or in chemical phenomenon, of course, because you've got the sort of the Luis can say more about Schelling and chemistry, of course. You've got this sort of repulsion and attraction going on in the cases, and then out of that you get a new product. And then in the organism, where this Störung, as he puts it, keeps going. So that's what distinguishes the organism, is that there is never stability, there's never Ruhe. It's always in a state of Störung, and this Störung is a self-incurred one. Whereas in chemical phenomena, it has to come from an external source. And he says the absolute hypothesis must be confirmed in experience, otherwise it's invalid. So of course, there has to be this dialogue with experience. But his aim is to see this absolute hypothesis in the various phenomena. So it's a very different starting point. And although they do, I think, really learn from one another, what I see as the kind of mark of these other thinkers is that they don't start with fundamental principles, but they start with observation and try to understand the form of the thing in front. They emphasize form and they emphasize phenomena, and they want to understand everything in its relation and in its context. And then they come to the insights that Schelling begins with, you could say. So where Schelling begins, they end. That would be my way of distinguishing their difference. So Schelling begins with the fundamental hypothesis, and that there's a kind of necessity and absoluteness that underpins all nature, and all of these things are connected to one another. And they begin by observing and trying to understand these phenomena in their relationships and in their individual and their internal integrity, and on that basis come to insights about continuity in nature and relations between phenomena in nature. So I'd say their starting points are different, their methodology is different. That's not to say that they can't actually gain a lot from each other. And I think that Humboldt's point when he says these two methods are not opposed is absolutely right. They're not opposed, they support one another, but they are not identical either.
Okay, thanks a lot. So we can now open the floor for a discussion with all participants. Perhaps I would like to add that if someone has a specific question for Christina, that person might ask her or his question first, because Christina has to leave in a few minutes. So, or if Christina, you want to get back to Dalia to, let's say, to open the discussion. In the meanwhile, those who want to ask a question can already use the raise hand function, and then I will give you the floor in the order. So perhaps, I don't know, Christina, do you want to say something? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, I'd love to. Yes, Dalia, thanks for your reply. And obviously I agree that Schelling and Humboldt have different starting points, although I think what I don't agree about is that it's so, I mean, actually I cannot disagree with you because you coined the term, so somehow you are the one saying what does romantic empiricism mean. but I have this feeling that it is not, or maybe that it should not be, or I don't know how to say it, just a bottom-up approach. I have the feeling that it is probably rather like both and neither. It's bottom-up and top-down at the same time, because as Humboldt says, if we only have like the manifold phenomena, experience, etc., we cannot master them. We need this idea. And okay, so maybe we cannot even start with the phenomena if we do not have some kind of idea that lets us gives us some access to it. I mean, form is some sort of idea that is there to master phenomena, if you want to think in that way. So I would not agree that these, I think it's the relation between idea and phenomenon is much more in an Humboldtian sense even interrelated than would be the thought of just bottom up and top down. I think that is too dichotomous in itself.
Yeah, that's very good. I agree with you that that one has to be really careful, because sometimes it can sound like they're just these sort of empiricists that don't have any kind of conceptual framework that they're working with. Completely agree with you. And maybe you're right. Maybe the concept is not simply about starting. It's not about where we start, but it's actually what our goal is. And so perhaps there's a place for sort of Schelling if the goal is the same. And that would be a really interesting kind of question, in what ways the goal is the same, where, and then I think that, yeah, it's a great kind of conversation, because if it's about the goal, then the notion of romantic empiricism is far bigger than what I've said it is, right? Because so many people had that same goal. So if we call it, it's not just a methodological approach. So that would be something to think about. I think the sort of what you're pointing to that's really important is where does the idea enter the picture? At which stage in the process of knowing? I think that's the really big question. And part of me wants to say, and maybe I'm wrong here, part of me wants to say that, well, where does the idea of form come from, and what role does form play here? Yeah, that's sort of going back to Julia and saying, look, Plato's here in the background, come on, you know, that's an important part of this heritage, or Aristotle, right? So it's not like they're just looking at the world in an empty, and they're not a blank slate. So they've got these ideas. So the question then is, what role does the idea play? Where does the idea of the form emerge as relevant and as particularly germane, like particularly illuminating, and how does it differ, in a way you could say, from the conceptual framework that Schelling is working with? I think those are the big questions. Yeah, thank you for pointing to them. Yeah.
And we have a question by Karin.
Yes. This was all very interesting. I enjoyed the discussion a lot, but at various points I had this question. Well, what is empiricist about this romantic empiricism? So I think that fits well with the discussion you just had, and with Christina's question as to whether ideas play a more important role. But maybe the question is also a more general one. Yes, because I tend to think of empiricism as a particular type of epistemology that is about the way in which the mind produces knowledge of objects and generates ideas and combines these ideas and so on. So that is a very different context in which the term empiricism is used. And I think that you use it in a more a broader sense, where it is more about the focus on observation and experience, as opposed to theory and why questions. But I have some doubts about the accuracy of the term. Yes, partly for the reasons Christina mentioned. Yes, that it's very hard to see how someone could do a study of phenomena independently of some theoretical assumptions, independently of a certain idea as to what needs to be clarified or brought to light. So I was wondering why you choose the term empiricism in the first place.
Okay, thanks so much. So in a way, the term empiricism is in connection to Schiller's use of the term rational empiricism to describe Goethe's methodology. So like I said, I could have at the very beginning called this rational empiricism, but I was happy that I didn't because of the fact that romantic signals other things besides rational, which became increasingly important for me. So in that context, for Schiller, the term empiricism is far more of a methodological term rather than an epistemological term. It has to do with this emphasis on observation, on starting with the phenomena rather than starting with a kind of a principle or a schema of knowledge or a logical necessary Grundsatz, so on. And so it's about a different starting point. And that's why my kind of conceptualization of romantic empiricism begins begins with emphasizes the methodological aspect of empiricism. That said, there are ways in which these thinkers are also empiricists, and Herder is particularly important in this regard because he is far more of an empiricist in the usual sense as a kind of epistemologist, because he thinks that our ideas emerge through experience, that we don't, so that he's much more of a kind of a Lockean empiricist than either Goethe or Humboldt. And this is where he and Kant, of course, diverge, and why he says that our ideas are historical and they're contextual and so on. So there are aspects and there are thinkers within this empiricist tradition that tend to be more empiricist in the common epistemological sense, and there are others which are much more methodological. But what unifies all three of them is this idea that we can't begin philosophy with the philosophy of nature with a principle or a schema by which we then go on and try to understand nature. Now then, what are their theoretical assumptions, as you said? Well, their theoretical assumptions come from big questions that were being asked at the time, that Kant posed, that Buffon posed, and they are basically, how do we deal with this infinite diversity of nature? How do we make sense of it? How, given all of these different forms in the natural world, we have an inkling that they're not just unrelated to one another. So that to me is the driving question. And so they develop their various conceptual tools and frameworks in order to address that question. In so doing, they don't begin with a schema of like in the way that, for instance, Schelling does. And so they start to try to understand relationships in relation to what they see. They try to see, okay, the fish is in water, as Herder said, and the bird flies in the air. How can we understand the structure of the fish in relation to the water, its element, the water? And how can we understand the structure of the bird in relation to its element, the air? And then compare them and see their skeletal structure in relation to one another and in relation to their context. So that's a very different way of going about trying to find continuity and relationship in nature than if you start with a general schema and then try to see that schema reiterated across various natural phenomena. Does that help, Karen?
Thanks.
Thank you, Dalia. Then there's a question by Luis.
Okay, yeah, so thank you, Dalia. This was amazing. This was really fascinating, and I really loved the book. I have a question, perhaps in the context of this discussion between naturphilosophy and romantic empiricism, but also related to romantic empiricism within itself. And because at least the way I read the naturphilosophy, I always get the impression that Schelling is trying to formulate a sort of unified account of nature and going into all these different disciplines and trying to understand what is happening in different contexts, and trying just to formulate a unifying account, a kind of unity of nature underlying everything. And that's why he comes with the absolute hypothesis and so on. And I think that this offers a very good comparison with Humboldt, because Humboldt, also because of the idea of the cosmos, he's also interested in this unified account. But I don't know where this idea of unity enters into your picture of the Romantic empiricism, and how do you see it within this tradition? And because I see it in Humboldt, but I don't know what you think of the others. And if you think that this could also be something to contrast or to bring together Naturphilosophie and Romantic empiricism. So what do you think about this?
Yeah, that's great. And it does follow very nicely from the questions from Karen and Christina. Yeah, so where does unity enter the picture? Unity, is it a sort of a regulative ideal, or is it something that we are going to look for and find in nature? Is one way of asking that question. Another way is to think, okay, well, Humboldt has the idea, like you said, Luis, of cosmos, and that is a kind of presupposition that there is some unity. So how does he come to it? And I think that what I found to be the crucial idea here is that for all of these thinkers, unity is something that they learned about through art. And this is where the artistic element becomes really important. So it's not an abstract formal unity. It's not a kind of, on the basis of A is A, we can on that basis derive a whole set of phenomena that are going to be in some way united to one another. But rather that if you look at, this is for Humboldt, this is why landscape painting was so important for Humboldt. If you look at a landscape painting, you see how all of these different parts of the painting are in relation to one another, and together they are a composition in the genuine sense that a work of art is a composition. It's not a formal unity, but it's an integrated, internally differentiated unity. And that's, I think, why art serves them a crucial cognitive function, because it teaches them to look for unity in a different kind of way. And so when Humboldt tells everyone in that lecture that he gives in Berlin, and when he returns from South America, the physiognomist of nature should model himself on the landscape artist. Well, it's because he should look at the world as a landscape artist would look at the world, and not as a transcendental philosopher would look at the world. Do you know? So there is unity, but it's a different kind of unity. And it's certainly the unity that I think Schelling wants to get at, but Schelling is not as explicit about it, and at least not in his early work, in when he's talking about the philosophy of nature. He starts to talk about art later, after his philosophy of nature phase, and sort of points to that as offering us the crucial kind of insight into unity, but not with the kind of emphasis that you see in Humboldt. So I think that unity certainly plays a crucial role here, but it's a specific kind of unity that they learn about, meine Erachtung nach, so to speak, through art, and all of them emphasize different artistic devices. Humboldt emphasizes the landscape painting. Goethe emphasizes poetry, and I think Herder emphasizes the significance of analogy in literature and so on, so that we could all get at this kind of unity that is also in difference, right? Because a poem is a unity, like a musical composition. It's a unity that only emerges in time and through all of these different things coming together, and each of them has its own distinctive role to play, right? So it's not at all a formal unity. It's a genuine composition. And that's what they start to understand about nature that they wouldn't have been able to understand if they hadn't looked at art as a kind of exemplar for understanding what unity is. Does that help?
Yes, it's great. Thanks.
Thank you. There's a question by Pavel.
It was along the same lines, and there's a question I think in the chat from Peter. You want to do that one first, because that one is also along the same area. I think it's a follow-up to Luis's in a way, in the chat.
Yeah. I will read the question. So Peter Wilson, how do you reconcile Herder's emphasis on observing and reproducing the differences between individual phenomena with his overriding emphasis on eternal laws that give unity to all these apparent individuals? And so he remarks, we see this emphasis in God, the IDs, etc. And so to Peter Wilson, it seems that the differences are found in order to later be displaced in favor of uniformity.
Mm-hmm. Well, Herder has I see in the library. Herder also says that, like I was giving you that example of the fish in the water and the bird in the air, and then he says, look at all the different kinds of vertebrates, that they all share the same skeletal structure. And he says, in the ideas, he says, if we want to understand nature, we have to think about the analogies of nature. Right. So what is an analogy? It's not simply pointing to identity, but it's also not simply pointing to difference. It's pointing to how something is like and unlike something else. So you have two things that are being compared. And then through this comparing of two things, you see the two of them more clearly. They gain in concreteness. So it's not as though he's excluding unity or excluding difference, but he's trying to see each one of through this comparative capacity to see how each one is itself, but also in relation to the context in which it is, and also in relation to those other beings. So you could say, like an analogy for Herder would be, the fins on the fish are like Flügel. I'm just sort of in Germany and keep on like the German words keep coming to me. The wings of a bird, right? So there are, for a fish in water, that's the wings. Sorry. So it's sort of like by seeing, and then we start to see, we see that these things are genuinely connected to the world in which they live. They emerged in relation to the world. They're not these things that don't have a world. And that's why I think Herder is so important for giving us this notion of an animal's world. The animal is a reflection of its world, and the world is a reflection of the animal. But we could also see continuity between the bird and the fish and between all of these different vertebrates. And on that basis, we arrive at the notion of a Hauptform for Herder. And so the Hauptform is not supposed to be kind of an umbrella concept that erases all differences. It's not kind of like, they're all mammals, therefore we're not going to think about their differences anymore. They're all vertebrates, so we're not going to. But through this Hauptform, we can see how they are like and unlike one another, and then understand how they emerged in relation to one another, how they emerged over time, and start to develop an idea of evolution, which Herder, is already kind of thinking about at that time. So I think that that's why for Herder, that statement that he makes in the Ideen, unless we look at the analogies of nature, we're just playing with mere words. So really, let's look at how things are like and unlike one another, and then we begin to grasp relationships in the natural world. Does that help, Peter?
Well, then I think we can have your question, Pavel. We can extend a little bit, unless it's really the same topic, and Dalia has already replied to your question.
Yeah, it's very similar along these lines. It was, well, maybe to bring another element to it. So to follow up Dalia's response to Karin and some of the other things said in response, I think so. In Kant's review of Herder's, it's not his philosophy of nature, but his history, he comments precisely on this issue, and he thinks Herder has this kind of disingenuous empiricism. So it pretends to be empiricism, but it's underpinned by all these extravagant metaphysical presuppositions about the world as a whole and all. So it's a kind of idealism that's even too extravagant for Kant, but sort of hiding underneath the surface. So Herder doesn't make it explicit, but it's sort of there underpinning his alleged empiricism. And you can kind of see it in some of the claims he makes in the philosophy of history, like, you know, providence is the final end of all history. That goes beyond, you know, what Kant would himself, or Kant would make the same point in a much more careful way. So I want to ask, yeah, what you think about that, and if it's the similar, or if a similar potential claim could be made about his philosophy of nature as his philosophy of history.
Well, Kant actually has the critique of the philosophy of nature, not just the philosophy of history, in the review of the ideas, in his 2 reviews. And the main critique that I think is kind of like the critique that he has of Herder is about analogy, about Herder's use of analogy, because I can't remember Kant's wording exactly, but he basically thinks that Herder is mixing things up through analogy. And Kant has a very different, much more refined understanding of analogy, its specific uses, when it can and when it can't be used. And of course, Kant says analogy is a crutch for the understanding. Right, so he's not so keen on analogy in the way that Herder is keen, and he says in the review. So to me, that's the kind of the crucial critique of Herder's methodology. In terms of the crucial critique of his doctrine, he thinks that Herder is trying to derive human reason from the upright gate. I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, is Kant right here to criticize Herder? There is something really different about human beings that you know, maybe our rational capacity is connected to, maybe not caused by, it's not a causal connection, but there might be a genuine kind of connection between our physical form and our ability to look up, right? You know, and that opens us up, and that's how Herder understands it, that precisely because we're not looking down anymore, we are opening up, we start to sort of be able to think in a far more open way. I don't see why Kant should exclude that as a possibility, except on his own, on the basis of his own principles of the sources of reason, of his anti-empiricist principles and what we would call today naturalist understanding of the sources of reason. Nonetheless, I think that what Herder is doing is not actually deriving in any kind of causal sense reason from the upright gate, as Ben was saying. This is my way of saving Herder from Kant, because I don't think that Herder's project is one of derivation. It's not about saying this is because of this, or this is, it's not, he's not offering a causal account of where reason comes from, but rather he's saying that reason is connected to all sorts of other things that human beings have. It's not just this random thing that God just puts in us, right? It's connected to the fact that we have 5 fingers, opposable thumbs. It's connected to the fact that we are upright. It's connected to the fact that we are the only beings that have languages, and so on. So there's a kind of an integrity to the human being as an organism, and reason is one manifestation of that. So it's not a derivation of reason from the physical form, but rather seeing reason as a manifestation of the human form, just as much as the upright gate is the manifestation of the same form, and that they're all connected in the same way that we would say the fish's gills are connected to its place in the water, its context. So there's a kind of integrity to the human form. And we can only get to that if we stop asking questions about what causes what and start looking at the phenomenon. And I think that's what is really fascinating about Herder's approach. Look at it, try to understand how all of these things are connected to one another and how they are all expressing one gesture. And that's the human gesture, or what he calls the Hauptform. In terms of the question about Kant's critique of Herder's use of analogy, I mean, that's something that I think is, you know, we could talk a lot about whether Kant is right or not about the role of analogy and so on. But ultimately, my view is that Kant uses analogy in the third critique quite a lot. He just has a very specific restriction. He says it's only in reflecting judgment. Right? But the whole as if, we look at the organism as if it were a natural end, or we look at the organism as if it were a work of art. That's analogy. We're comparing two things and trying to understand the one through the other while also recognizing difference, right? But this as if has no cognitive value for Kant, while it does for Herder. So I think those are the crucial differences. And then you'd ask, like, should it have cognitive value? Is it something that is actually expanding our empirical knowledge? And Herder would say, yes, it is.
Okay, thanks. I have perhaps a small question for you, Dalia, at the end of this discussion. Some years ago, I bought this beautiful edition of Cosmos by Humboldt, so in the edition by Hans Magnus Enzensberger. And when I was trying, so to say, to read this book, what I lacked as a philosopher is a bit the theoretical parts. So the things I find in Schelling, I find in Kant. And so this Entwurf einer physischen Weltbeschreibung, how would you say, should we as philosophers, how should we read this work? Because I mean, if you want to read all of it, you need a lot of time. And so where should we start as philosophers?
Well, I wouldn't start with Cosmos.
Okay.
That's a late work, and I think that his methodology is most clear in his early writings, in the collection of essays that is known as Ansichten der Natur. Okay. And that's the place that this is his first work, and it's his, he says, he calls it his favorite work. It's the one that he says he has a letter to Carolina von Wolzogen, Schiller's sister-in-law, where he says, everything that I learned that I was doing in South America, I did because of my Jena connections. And then he mentions specifically the organs of perception he was able to develop through his work with Goethe. And he says that this is the outcome, this book is the outcome of that. And so you could see much more clearly the kind of Goethean impulse in that early work. Whereas in this late work, he's sort of gathering all of this stuff together and so much empirical data and information, and it becomes overwhelming. So if you want to just get at Humboldt's sort of basic insights and where his kind of connections lie to these other thinkers, the earlier work is the best entry point. Okay, thanks. That's helpful. Well, I think we can conclude here the official part of our meeting, but not before I ask you to join me in thanking again Dalia, Julia, Benjamin, and also Christina, who has left already, unfortunately. But I liked this very much, as this was really beautiful and interesting discussion. And so also from me personally, many thanks for being here and for making this possible. Thank you. Thank you very much, Henny. And I also want to thank Louise and Karen for making this possible, and everyone else for coming.